Okay, welcome back to Bio 11. Today we're going to start with the fetal pig dissection. Had we been in lab, we would have been actually dissecting a fetal pig, all right, and having a lot of fun with that. Uh, but, you know, being what the circumstances are, we get the second best, virtual dissection. All right, so the fetal pig is a representative of the mammalian anatomy. We learn it because it reflects our own anatomy. It's not 100% the same, but it's pretty close. And so I start off with kind of a continuation of the Animal Diversity Lab. All right, and if you're just tuning in, um, we are one day ahead of schedule. So we did the Animal Diversity Lab last Thursday. I hope, by the way, that you all had a safe and great weekend. Okay, so what is a mammal? Well, a lot of people say things like mammals don't lay eggs, and mammals are warm-blooded. But the thing is, yeah, those things are true, but they don't make mammals unique. So being endothermic, yeah, that's a key characteristic. But they are warm-blooded, in other words. But so are birds, and you know other dinosaurs, or probably also the extinct dinosaurs, were also warm-blooded, most likely. All right. The fact that mammals don't lay eggs, well, it's not really true. There is a group of mammals that lays eggs. All right. So the most important thing would be the presence of hair, the presence of mammary glands, and really also heterodonty, which is having different kinds of teeth. If you look at a shark, all the teeth of a shark are the same. And in reptiles and frogs, when they have teeth, the teeth are all the same. There's no variation of forms of teeth within the same mouth. Another thing is we have three inner ear bones: the incus, malleus, and stapes. All right, so here's the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. All right. So for example, some reptiles only have two of these bones. Some amphibians don't have any. All right, so it does distinguish mammals, but I would say the most important characteristics would be hair and mammary glands. Mammary glands being the glands that produce milk for offspring. All right, so I did say there were some egg-laying mammals, and those are these guys, the prototherians, right? So, or also known as the monotremes. Okay, uh, they're they're kind of primitive-looking mammals, very ancestral in their characteristics. They lay eggs, for example. Uh, they don't have their mammary glands all in one organ. They have them spread out. So they're spread out on their skin. So you have dermal glands which secrete milk, and the young will drink it from the ends of the hair. Right, the position of the legs is a little bit different. This is, you don't need to know this. Oh, I don't know why that's happening. Okay, you don't need to know this part. Don't worry about that. That's for a more advanced class. Okay, also, they even, especially this duck-billed platypus, I think the echidna also, they have venom glands on their hind feet. Okay, kind of like a reptile would have venom glands on one of its legs or something. Another group of mammals are the metatherians, also known as the marsupials. All right. They don't lay an egg. They have a shellless egg. inside the body, right? And has a chorion. Remember, I discussed what a chorion was last week, right? And that chorion becomes a short-lived placenta. And the monotremes, the metatherians or the marsupials are famous for the young, for giving birth to underdeveloped young who crawl out of the mother and crawl into a pouch. These are the pouch mammals. And from there, they continue growing as they drink milk from the mammary nipples. All right. By the way, we have a marsupial here. It's native to the city, native to the northeast, or actually most of the United States, is the possum, or some people call it the opossum. Maybe you've seen it in your neighborhoods at night. They're quite common. They're nocturnal, and so you don't get to see them as much. And that brings us to our group, the placentals, which includes rodents, carnivores like dogs and cats, bears, elephants, whales, and hoofed animals like the pig, antelopes, horses, things like that, primates, and bats, and a few others that I'm missing. So the placentals, by far, the most common mammals that you can find on the planet. So what is a placental? Placental has what we call a placenta that protects the fetus. Okay, so the placenta is like you could almost call it the egg, but not really. So the placenta is a membrane that surrounds the fetus, surrounds the amnion. Here, all this fluid in here is amniotic fluid, and the baby or the fetus will connect to the placenta. Will connect um, to the placenta via the umbilical cord. Okay. So there's the umbilical cord, and there's a tissue layer of placenta on the baby side, this side here, and on the mother side, which is this. Okay. And notice that the blood vessels from the fetus do not physically come into contact with the mother's blood vessels. There's something called the intervillous space. Now, why would that be important? Well, let's say the fetus blood type is quite different from the mother's blood type. That could potentially be a dangerous situation for both. So the system has evolved so that there's a space between the capillaries of both organisms, and that space is small enough for oxygen to diffuse into the bloodstream of the fetus, carbon dioxide to diffuse from the fetus to the mother, so the mother can get rid of the carbon dioxide waste for the fetus, and also nutrients, right? Nutrients are going from the mom to the fetus, and metabolic waste is going back. All right, so here's a depiction of that. Here's a very young fetus over here. Not quite. It's still an embryo. Has an amniotic sac. Has a yolk sac still depending on the yolk sac, right? And there's the chorion that surrounds it all. No allantois. Remember, I spoke about the allantois last week. No allantois because you have the placenta that takes care of that metabolic waste. The yolk sac goes away, and the placenta completely takes over the job of the yolk sac, which is to provide nutrients. Okay, so here's the amniotic sac. Okay, well, that brings us to today's main lesson, and that is learning about the anatomy of the fetal pig. All right, once you learn the anatomy of the fetal pig, you can pretty much have a good idea of what your own anatomy is. Internal anatomy is the most important. We'll point out the differences. Well, I'll point out differences and as we go along, and we'll make sure that you guys are aware of the two. All right. So the first thing you would do and get a sense of position. All right. So this is what the fetal pig would look like. You have the umbilical cord, which is here, which would have been cut. It might be a little bit longer than this. Okay, and uh, maybe you would see a slash here in the neck. This is where the blood was drained out of the pig, and then what they normally do is they inject latex that's dyed red or blue into the vein, so that when you open the pig, you're able to tell, oh, the blue must be a vein. If it's red, it must be an artery. It doesn't work 100%, but for the most part, it does. Okay. So we got to know our positions, right? All right. The sagittal plane, by the way, is just the plane of symmetry, right? The side that you're looking at here in this picture is the same as the other side, and if you cut the two sides in half, it would be at the sagittal plane. So the back half of the pig is the posterior end, and of course the anterior end is the front. So remember, anterior is closer to the head, and posterior is closer to the anus. And you have also the dorsal side and the ventral side. Ventral being towards the belly, dorsal towards the back. So remember these two. You have posterior, anterior, and these two, dorsal and ventral, and they are not interchangeable with each other. And one of the first things we'd be asking you to do is to sex your pig. Is it male or is it female? Well, you got to look. You got to look, right, to make sure. So, of course, both sexes would have the anus right underneath the tail. And if it were a male, you'd see a scrotal sac. So that's the scrotum. Scrotum. Okay. And underneath the umbilical cord, that is posterior to the umbilical cord, just posterior, right next to it, really, is the urogenital opening. And this here would be, let me write that. This would be the penis. The opening of the penis is right there. Okay. So here it is again. And for some reason, people are always thrown off by the nipples. Oh, and they say a lot of students would say, well, it has lots of nipples, so it must be a female. And then I point out, especially if the student speaking to me is a male, and I say, "What? Don't you have nipples?" Of course. All right. So it doesn't really matter whether it's male or female. We would still have nipples. Now, if it was a female, okay, there's no genital opening by the umbilical cord. Everything is here by the anus. So it would have the anus, that's one opening, and a urogenital opening right above it, or ventral. to the anus. Right, it's above it, or actually below it, because the anus would be higher. Um, so the urogenital opening is a common opening for the vagina and for the urethra, which the two are fused at this stage in life for the fetal pig, and they do become separate as it ages. All right, so be aware of the urogenital opening and what it means. Okay, so um, make sure that you know the difference between male. Oops, sorry about that. Between male, this would be the male, and female. Okay, so make sure you know the difference in how they look. So on the exam, I'll probably use a lot of the pictures that you'll be seeing in the next 3 labs. All right, so it's very easy for me to just take one of these pictures and blank out the writing and then ask you guys to identify them. All right, so here is the oral cavity. After you have looked at the external anatomy of the fetal pig. Oh, and by the way, a few other things here. Your lab manual might ask you to check for hair. There'll be a little couple of hairs right on the chinny chin chin there. So a few hairs on the chin of the fetal pig. It might be some fetal pigs have fur all over the place. There's a little fur there as well. As they get older, they are completely covered in fur. And the book also asks you to identify the location of the heel. So here's the heel, right? The fetal pig is an ungulate, which means that it's a hoofed animal. So here are hoofs. Basically, the hoofs are the toes, right? So this is an animal that walks on its toes, not the whole foot. I just remembered something else here. Okay. In the other thing you would be asked to do is to take a look at the eye. All right, so the eye, if you open it up, it would have, let me see if I can draw it. Here's the eye. Here's the pupil. And then it would have a white membrane. So here's the eye. And this white membrane is called the nictitating membrane. Okay, so the nictitating membrane is a vestigial organ. Vestigial. Okay, it's a vestigial organ that in the ancestors, our ancestors, we have it too. Next time you look at your eyes in the mirror, just you can see a little tiny little white membrane at the corner of your eye, right by your nose. And the vestigial membrane will, uh, in our ancestors, when it was fully functional, would have been like an inner eyelid. And the best example I can think of is if you've ever seen those nature shows where they show an alligator and the alligator pops its head out of the water or it's about to go into the water, and you see this clear, transparent membrane covering the eyes uh, just after it comes up from the water, or it covers the eyes just before. All right, so that's what that is, and obviously we don't need that anymore. All right, so now after you finish with the external anatomy, then it's time to start digging inside. Okay, so you have, well, here's the mouth, right? Here's the mouth. Sorry. Um, Here's the mouth and the snout. In other words, you have the nostrils, right? And here's the tongue. Here's the tongue. We opened. We would open the mouth by cutting here and cutting there, right? The muscles that hold the mouth together, the jaw and the cranium together. And we would see on the top of the mouth, on the inside, you'd see some teeth, right? So these guys are born with teeth. So that's a difference. We know that humans are not born with teeth. Human mammals, human babies is what I meant. And you guys can go ahead and feel with your tongues your hard palate, which is this section here. Very hard structure on the roof of your mouth. And just behind it is a soft palate. Okay, so this is the hard palate. Okay, and here, I'll cover it in red, is the soft. Soft. Okay. All right. Now, I would at this point, the students would say, "Okay, we looked at the mouth," and I would say, "You haven't cut deep enough yet." And they look at me like I have two heads on top of my original head, and I say, "Yeah, I'm sorry, but you do have to keep cutting because you want to take a look at the epiglottis." All right. So at the back of your mouth, there's a structure that prevents you from choking, and that is this little tab here. I like it blue better. Okay, so this little tab here is a little covering to the glottis. All right, it's a little covering to the glottis, which is the opening to the esophagus. All right, so let me write this down. So this here, we call that the epiglottis, which is the covering of, let's say not to, but of the esophagus. All right. Well, actually, sorry about that. Epiglottis, which is the covering of the glottis, which is the opening. Of the esophagus. I think I wrote this all down for you guys at the end of this presentation. Okay, so remember the epiglottis, which is this little structure, covers the glottis, which is the opening of the esophagus. So whenever you swallow food or water or saliva, the epiglottis will automatically cover um, sorry, not the opening of the esophagus. I apologize. Oh, I don't know why I'm making these mistakes. Opening of the trachea. All right, I apologize for that, guys. So the epiglottis, which is the covering of the glottis, and the glottis is the opening of the trachea. Whenever you swallow, whenever you eat or drink or swallow some saliva, the epiglottis would automatically cover the opening of the trachea so that any of those things don't end up in your trachea. All right. When it doesn't do its job correctly, you have this automatic coughing response. So here's a look. Okay, this is a kind of like a diagram of what it would look like on the inside. If you were to do I guess a long section, cut the head in half and see what's inside in the middle. All right, you have the nasal cavity, which is this, and it's the nasopharynx. Okay. Well, I'll just say nasal cavity. Let's not call it pharynx. Nasal cavity. All right. Okay. Nasal cavity. And that leads to an opening, which is the pharynx. And you have the oral cavity, right? The opening of the mouth, which is this. And that leads to the same opening. So this little space here, which we call the pharynx, is a common opening for both the breathing tubes and the feeding tube. So you have the breathing tube, which goes through the nasal cavity, past the pharynx, and into the trachea, into the larynx, which is the first part of the trachea, and then the trachea proper. And then you have the digestive tube, which is the oral cavity. You have the oral cavity, passes through this pharynx, and then it goes into the esophagus and to the stomach. So note the positions. The esophagus, which is here, the esophagus is dorsal to the trachea. All right. And that's the epiglottis right there. And it covers the trachea. Okay. So we will cut our pig. And we'll take a look on the inside. We'd start at the gash that they had started here in the neck. A little gash there. And we would be able to do a little incision and cut with the scissors and spread the skin out a bit. So we would cut this way, and that way, this way, and that way. So we could make flaps and open it up. All right. And as you can see, there's a diffuse gland. By diffuse, I mean it's spread out. That is found just about everywhere around, and it goes as far as covering the heart. And that's the thymus gland. And the thymus gland, all right, well, there's a slide at the end of this where I tell you what the thymus gland is about. Okay. So there's a lot of tissue that you have to cut through, and uh, there's a lot of work that you have to put into it to clear all the organs that you want to see. Okay. And Underneath this thymus gland, this thymus gland is basically covering the trachea. And under that would be the esophagus. And there's another little gland right around here, which I'll show you in the next slide. Okay. All right, so here's the thymus. It's been spread out a bit. There. So this stuff and that stuff. And in buried in there is another gland. And that gland, we call it the thyroid. It looks like a little kidney bean. It's a little reddish, darkish thing. It's kind of not mistakable. You can't confuse it for anything else. All right. So if I were to ask you guys to identify the thyroid, it would be in the neck region. It would be round. It would be reddish, brownish reddish, and it would look kind of like a kidney bean or something. I would describe it as such. Okay. Here is a picture of the thymus that was removed, and the cut was moved up a little bit further, closer to the chin. So up higher, closer to the chin, would be a large structure connected to the trachea, which is this here, and it's the larynx. The larynx is also the voice box. And you would be able to recognize the trachea because the trachea is ringed with cartilage. All right, so the trachea is cylindrical. It's ringed with cartilage, which keeps it open. Right, it's important to keep the trachea open because you don't want it to collapse. You want air to be able to freely move through the trachea at all times. Underneath the trachea, is the esophagus. So dorsal to the trachea is the esophagus. It's closer to the back, and the trachea is more ventral. It's closer to the belly, and that's this thing. And that's a tube that's not. It's not different from the intestines, for example. It's a tube that's flat and only expands when there's something in it. Right? It doesn't have to be open all the time. It's just, in fact, it's not a good idea. Otherwise, your food will easily move up. And so you want to keep it nice and closed as much as possible. Then you would cut it a little further down, and you would cut through the sternum, which is the breastplate, the breastbone, and spread the ribs, and you would see. Well, first you would see the lungs, which are these things, and in this picture they've removed the heart. Okay, so the heart would be here. This is, by the way, they're showing you here the pleural cavity. Pleural cavity, or the cavity of the lungs. Right, and the cardiac cavity and the pleural cavity together, the space where the heart and the lungs are, would be called the thoracic cavity. So this is the whole thing. This whole opening here is the thoracic cavity. right? Here in this picture, I included this one because I wanted to show you the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So up here, you have the thoracic, and down here you have the abdominal. Okay. In this picture, you can see the heart, which is right there. All right, still being covered up, and the lungs would be on either side. But this here, this thin white membrane, it's actually a muscle, and it's the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the muscle that helps you breathe, that forces you to breathe. Okay. In this next picture, the diaphragm has been moved down a bit. Here are the lungs. So these are the lungs. The diaphragm has been pushed out of the way. You see the lungs, which extend up here. This is the bottom of the lungs. It's right in the middle. Same thing here. Here's another view of that diaphragm. And it splits, it runs across the body. It splits the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And here are the lungs and the heart right in the middle. Okay. So once we get past the thoracic cavity in the neck, we move on to the abdominal cavity. Okay, so just underneath the diaphragm, so the diaphragm is here somewhere. It's easy to cut away though. Is the largest organ in the abdomen, which is the liver, this thing. And we can see it here. So this is the liver here. Here the liver is being covered by the diaphragm. You can see it again here. Here's the liver. Okay. Very large organ. So you have the liver, which is responsible for storing um, glucagon and producing bile. And bile is a secretion that emulsifies fats. So if you eat fatty foods, the liver is signaled to produce bile, and bile gets into your digestive system. And by emulsify, I mean it separates, it starts to digest the fat. It separates the fats so that the fats become smaller particles and much easier for the body to digest. And oftentimes it makes more than is necessary, and the gallbladder will store the bile and it will release the bile when it needs it right away. So the gallbladder is a little green bag-like structure. Here it is. Okay. And it'll connect to your stomach. Right. So there's a duct that connects to it. Here it is, the bile duct. And it'll connect to the stomach, basically the same place that the liver connects to the stomach. So here you have your liver, your stomach. Okay, here's your gallbladder. Right. Other parts that you would have to be able to identify is the beginning of the small intestine. Well, all of this is the small intestine. but it kind of begins over here, right? This part, and that's the duodenum. The duodenum is the first portion of the small intestine, which connects directly to the stomach. Then you also have another organ, which is called the pancreas. All right, and the pancreas is another diffuse structure. It actually is not just in this location. It goes over into this area here. I think I have a better picture of that somewhere else. All right, so also be able to identify small intestine versus large intestine. Okay, small intestine is actually longer, but it's thinner. And the large intestine is much, much thicker. Okay, so here it is. That's one portion. There's another portion there, here. Here's a nice picture of the gallbladder and the bile duct. Gallbladder, bile duct. And remember, the gallbladder is always attached to the underside of the liver. Here's another view of the small intestine, which is thinner than the large intestine. Here's another view of the liver. Here's the stomach, which is kind of underneath the liver as well. This is the large intestine. See how large that is? And the small intestine is much thinner. But the organ of interest here is the spleen. So there's one that we haven't spoken about yet. So on your left side of your abdomen, lining the wall of your abdomen, is the spleen, which is responsible for filtering the blood, and it's also responsible for keeping stores of excess blood, just in case you need some blood for some reason. Can replace blood really quickly. It's important for your immune response. Okay. Underneath this knife here, this scalpel, is the stomach and the spleen. It's been moved aside, and you can see the pancreas. It's a little grainy structure, kind of like not too dissimilar from the thymus gland, and it keeps extending further that way. Okay. You have is another view of the pancreas. All right, so this is the stomach here, and the liver up there. I'm giving you guys different views of the same thing over and over. Here's the spleen, by the way, which is this structure here. I always draw it. I always describe it as a tongue-like organ. You know, it's long, it's flat, rounded at the end, like your tongue. And here, this is the large intestine, and here's a little piece of the small intestine. This is the umbilical cord. This is a male. Note the general opening there. So this thing is the penis there. Okay. And I'll draw it in blue maybe. This diffuse That's your pancreas. And there's a little piece there also. That's your pancreas. Okay. And yet another view. Here's the pancreas. And here's your stomach and the spleen. It's very easy to identify the spleen because it's flat, it's long, and it's rounded at the end. Okay, there's the liver. Okay, you can see the difference here in the large intestine and the small intestine. All right, so these pictures I got from these two websites, and you guys can go through them and basically you can do the parts of the dissections that I covered. If there are portions that I did not cover here, and you guys don't have to worry about it, and there are some. Uh, yeah, okay, I'll email those links. There are some definitions here. All right, so just know thymus gland. Well, the thymus gland is part of your lymphatic system, right? So it's part of creating blood cells, white blood cells. And remember, your lymphatic system is a series of tubes. It's a lot similar to your blood vessels. And actually, yeah, it's very, very similar to the blood vessels, and it has what we call lymphatic fluid, which includes immune response fluid, and it's full of white blood cells and things like that that will protect you from infections. And there's a parasite that takes advantage of the lymphatic system and travels through it, but I won't talk about that. All right, the larynx. Remember the larynx? I showed it to you. Is the voice box, which is it's part of the trachea, but it's just anterior to the proper trachea. So it's this big, large structure at the top, right before the trachea starts. And remember, the trachea you can um, distinguish by those rings of cartilage. The thyroid gland, I showed you that as well. It was a little bean-like structure. All right, so that secretes hormones that travel in the blood. It's kind of like one of those master glands that regulates your body. It regulates your metabolic rate, which means it also controls how you feel. Like, do you feel cold? Do you feel hot? Do you feel jittery? Do you feel calm? That sort of thing. So if there are problems with the thyroid gland, you have all sorts of symptoms like changes in temperature or changes in in how calm you feel. Do you feel jittery or like going really fast or really lethargic? Okay. Then you have, I showed you the lungs. We all know what those are for, right? We know what the heart is for. I showed you that. The peritoneum is something you couldn't see in these pictures. So the peritoneum is a thin tissue that covers your abdomen. All right, it's covered. So if you were to open the muscles, skin, go through the skin and go through the muscles of the pig or any mammal in the abdomen, you would peel away all the muscles, and you would still have a thin membrane that covers everything on the inside. That's the peritoneum. And sometimes, well, they always do, you have double layers, which are called mesenteries, and those are like webbing that hold all the organs in place. So oftentimes, as you're cutting through the pig and you're trying to see the stomach and see all these other things, you're cutting through mesenteries in order to clear them. Okay. There's the liver, which was the largest organ in the abdomen. right? And it gets rid of some of the things that it does is rid of old blood cells, produces bile, I told you about that, stores glycogen, and maintains blood glucose levels. All right, glycogen is how we store sugar. The stomach stores and digests food. Remember that it's mechanical and chemical digestion. So your mouth is also mechanical and chemical digestion. You chew up your food, that's mechanical, and there are some digestive enzymes in your saliva. So that's chemical digestion, like we discussed amylase, right? It breaks down starch. So that's one of the reasons why when you eat bread, right? Bread isn't sugary for the most part, but if you eat regular white Wonder Bread, for example, and if you keep it in your mouth long enough, the amylase in your saliva will make it start to taste sugary because it's breaking down the starch from the large um, from the large molecule, which is a series of sugars, into smaller sugar-like molecules. Right, and the stomach receives food from the mouth via the esophagus. And remember, the esophagus was dorsal to the trachea. So if you wanted to see the esophagus if you had a real pig, you'd have to dig behind the trachea. Then there's the spleen, right? It's a lymphoid organ in the lymphatic system. It contains both white and red blood cells. It's important in your immune system. It also filters the blood. So any damaged blood cells that are damaged in any way go through the spleen, and the spleen is composed of very many small passageways, and they're shaped a certain way so that if it's a healthy cell, it'll go right through it, but the damaged ones get trapped. Then you have the small intestine. Okay, the small intestine, which is the site of continued digestion. So you don't just digest in the stomach, you also digest food in your small intestine, and you begin the absorption of the products of digestion. So the small intestine is highly vascularized, has a lot of blood vessels attached to the walls of the small intestine. That's so that your blood system can start absorbing the products of digestion. Okay, and consists of three portions, the three parts: the duodenum, which is um, the part of the small intestine that connects to the stomach. I'm trying to see if I can find the photo that best shows that. Let me see. Not that. I thought I showed one. Here it is. The duodenum, right? Here's the stomach, and here's the sphincter. The sphincter is just a muscular ring that closes, right? And it opens up when the stomach is ready to empty its contents into the small intestine. And that first portion is the duodenum. And then there's the middle portion with the jejunum and then the ileum. Don't have to really know these two. It's just I should ask you to remember that duodenum. Okay, I am asking you to remember that. Remember the gallbladder. Remember the gallbladder stores and releases bile. That's what I try to write there. Stores and releases bile. And remember, I said that it emulsifies fats. It breaks the fats apart into smaller, more digestible, more easily digestible portions. Okay, then the pancreas. What for? Well, it's an exocrine gland secreting. It's both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. So it secretes pancreatic juice for food digestion, and it also secretes hormones and that regulate blood glucose levels, like insulin and glucagon. All right, so insulin, remember, helps to use the sugar in your blood, and glucagon helps to release the sugar in the glycogen. The large intestine comes after the small intestine, and it reabsorbs. I should have written reabsorbs. So let's cut that out. Reabsorbs. Why do I say reabsorbs? Because there's a lot of water that goes to digestion, and then your large intestine will reabsorb it into the body, so that your fecal matter isn't full of water. Right, that would be a massive waste of water. All right, and so it reabsorbs the water into your system and prepares the feces for defecation. That's whatever's left that hasn't been digested, so whatever's not digestible. So the large intestine has the coiled part, which is the colon, the main portion of the large intestine. And then it has a straight section, which runs up and down your body, which is the rectum. Right? That's why it's called the rectum. Rectum meaning straight. All right, so that takes us to the end of the slideshow, and we'll go into the lab manual. Okay. So this is the copy of the lab that I have here for basic mammalian anatomy. Okay, so here we go. The first question they ask you is, okay, well, the book tells you, look for the genitals, look for the umbilical cord, and of course you won't be able to see the placenta. It doesn't come with a placenta, but the umbilical cord connects to the placenta. That's how I started this. And number 5, the pig walks on its toenails, which would be like a ballet dancer on tiptoe. Notice how your heel touches the ground when you walk, whereas the heel of the pig, right? It's I would say, how would you say this? I would say high above the ground. Yeah. Right. I showed you that picture where I pointed out the heel for you guys. What is the function of the umbilical cord? Right. Connects to the placenta. And you guys can talk about how it exchanges oxygen for carbon dioxide. Well, that's the function of the placenta. Okay. The placenta functions as exchange for gas, and exchange for nutrients, and metabolic waste. Okay, locate the small nipples, the external openings of the mammary glands. The nipples are not an indication of sex, since both males and females. How many nipples does a pig have? Don't worry about that. You don't need to know that. Okay, especially since you don't have the pig. But the pictures that I showed you do have clearly visible the nipples, so you'll be able to count them. When is it advantageous for a pig to have so many nipples? And from the picture, you were able to see that it had two rows of nipples, not just two nipples, but rows of them, right? Because, pigs are known for having a lot of young at once, right? So give birth, they they give birth to many piglets, I guess you can call them piglets, at one time. So you need all of those nipples to make sure that all the pigs are able to drink milk. Can you find hair on the pig? Absolutely. Where? Well, there's some on the chin, the elbow, and on the back sometimes. All right. So you guys can use these diagrams to study as well. Locate the anus under the tail. Name the organ system that ends in the opening of the anus. Well, that's the digestive system, right? Digestive. Right, from the mouth to the anus. What is the sex of your pig? Don't worry about that portion. Here they're showing the oral cavity, right? And you could see the teeth are already out. You could see the hard palate, the soft palate, the epiglottis. Explain why it is correct to say that the air and food passages cross in the pharynx. So I explained this before, right? So here's the air passage and here's the food passage, and they both cross at this intersection, which is the pharynx. You guys write that however you feel like writing it. But basically, you have a common opening for the air passage and the food passage. Okay. So yeah, absolutely answer this, right? Answer that. Okay. Pull back the flaps created by these cuts that you cut on the ventral side of the pig. Expose the thoracic cavity. Explain what the thoracic cavity was. Okay, so fill that out. List the organs you find in the thoracic cavity. Just two. We're just going to keep it at two. Just two organs. Okay? List them. One's about blood and one's about breathing. Okay, now name the two cavities separated by the diaphragm. I gave you the answer to that today. All right, so you guys can fill that out. There's an organ that the diaphragm separates the thoracic and the other cavity. List the organs located now in this one. All right, and it gives you the answers anyway, so you guys can totally do that. List the organs located in the abdominal cavity, and I went through all of them, all the ones, except for I forgot to discuss the kidneys. Well, I didn't forget. I'm leaving the kidneys for 2 days from now. Okay, so you have the kidneys plus all these other organs that I discussed today. and dot, 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 dot. You guys fill it in. All right. So by the way, in this cut, all right, so here's one cavity and here's the other cavity. And in the middle, which is separating the two, is the diaphragm. Okay. Here, they're asking you heart and lungs. Okay. If you have not yet done so, fold back the chest wall flaps. To do this, you will need to tear the thin membranes and divide the thoracic cavity into 3 compartments. The left pleural cavity, which is where the left portion, the left lobes of the lung are, and the right pleural cavity containing the right lung, and the pericardial cavity containing the heart. Examine the lungs. Locate the 4 lobes of the right lung and the 3 lobes of the left lung. The trachea, which is dorsal to the heart, so it runs behind the heart, divides into the bronchi, which enters the lungs. Later, when the heart is removed, you will be able to see the trachea and the bronchi. So, sequence the organs of the respiratory tract. Right, you have the nostrils, then the nasal cavity, and then it passes through the pharynx, right, that common opening, then into the glottis, and then remember the glottis is the opening of the trachea, which is the first part of the trachea is the larynx, and then the trachea, and then you have the bronchi, and then you have the lungs. So there's quite a few. Nostrils, nasal cavity, pharynx, glottis, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs. Okay. Now going into the abdominal cavity. The liver, the largest organ in the abdomen, performs numerous vital functions, including disposing of worn-out red blood cells, producing bile, storing glycogen, maintaining the blood glucose level, producing bile proteins. Okay, locate the liver. Also, it filters your blood from impurities, uh, like alcohol, for example. Locate the liver, a large brown organ. Its anterior surface is smoothly convex and fits snugly into the concavity of the diaphragm. All right, so what they're saying here is, okay, this way. You have your liver, which is convex, because the diaphragm has a concavity, right? It's also convex. So name several functions of the liver. Oh, they're just telling you to repeat these things, right? You guys can do that. And the stomach is part of what system? Of course, you know it's digestive. What is its function? Okay, I gave you the answer to that in the PowerPoint. The spleen is part of what system? I also gave you the answer to that, and I gave you the functions, so you guys can refer to the PowerPoint, right? And fill that out. The small intestine is part of what system? You know that. Okay, you know the answer to that, so fill it in. What is its function? I also gave you the answer to that. Okay. What is the function of the gallbladder? Once again, I gave you the answer. What is the function of the pancreas? I also gave you the answer to that. So make sure you refer to the PowerPoints for that. The large intestine is part of what system? Of course, you also know the answer to that. What is the function of the large intestine? I also wrote that down for you. Sequence the organs of the digestive system to trace the path of food from the mouth to the anus. So you start mouth. I'm not sure if that's different, but we'll put the next one as the oral cavity. Okay. Then we have the pharynx again. Then we have the esophagus. Then we have the stomach. Small intestine. Intestine. Large intestine. And then anus. That's the exit point. Okay, so here's I guess another picture diagram showing all the parts. Okay, you guys can go over that. What are some major differences? Number of nipples, right? Teeth are present in the fetus. And see if you can think of any others. That brings us to the end. Told you today would be shorter. What directional term refers to the head end of the fetal pig? It's anterior. If the urogenital opening is just anterior to the anus, is the fetal pig male or female? Okay, so you have, in other words, you have the anus, and just anterior to it is the urogenital opening, and that would be female. Here's the tail, by the way. Okay. Okay, that's my very bad drawing of the thing. Oh, yeah, that's very bad drawing. Okay. Okay. So that would be the anus, and this one is the urogenital opening. It just happens to be a little bit ventral. Sorry, a little bit anterior according to this book. I would describe it more as ventral. Okay. What space is dorsal to the oral cavity and has 3 openings? So there's a cavity that's above the oral cavity, and we call that the nasal cavity. What is the name of the flap that closes during swallowing to prevent food and fluids from entering the trachea? The epiglottis. What is the structure that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity? We answered that before, right? You have the diaphragm. What glandular organ is especially large in fetal pigs since their immune systems are still developing? Okay, you have the thymus gland. And I told you this is especially large because it extends up around the neck and it all the way down and covers the also. Is the trachea ventral or dorsal to the esophagus? Okay, so the trachea would be ventral to the esophagus. The esophagus is dorsal to the trachea. In what thoracic cavities are the lungs located? Uh, Pleural cavities. All right, pleural cavities. So you can refer to the book. What is the largest organ in the abdominal cavity? Liver. What organ do secretions from the gallbladder and pancreas enter? That would be the stomach. Stomach. You guys check on me. I think maybe I made a mistake here. It's either the stomach or the small intestine. Actually, let's read up on this. All right. The bile duct, which runs in the mesentery, stretching between the liver and the duodenum, find the gallbladder embedded. So it connects to the duodenum. All right. So yeah, I knew I was wrong. All right. So let's not call it the stomach. Okay. So what organ do secretions from the gallbladder and pancreas enter? That would be the small intestine. Let's be specific about it. Duodenum. What is the name of the tissue that holds the small intestines together? Oh, that would be mesenteries. What is the name of the first part of the large intestine? Okay. Um, the first part of the large intestine. Let's make sure. The main portion of the large is the colon. And the first part of the large intestine is called the cecum. Okay. Which I never teach, but whatever. What organ produces digestive enzymes and hormones that regulate blood glucose? What organ produces digestive enzymes and hormones that regulate blood glucose? You have the liver. To what organ system do the kidneys belong? Uh, so the kidneys belong to the um, urinary system. Okay, we'll discuss more about that in a couple of days. Okay, so you guys are not responsible for these questions here, although they're a little bit interesting, right? Why would someone born without a gland be likely to suffer from a greater number of infections? Because the thymus gland is part of the immune system, especially when young. Treatments for a person's laryngeal cancer might require surgical removal of the epiglottis. What would post-surgical therapy for this person involve? I guess learning how to swallow correctly because you might accidentally breathe in your food on a regular basis. Based on the location of the spleen, explain what is damaged so often in car accidents, especially when the driver's side is struck. Well, the spleen is right there along the abdominal wall, right? On the left side of your abdomen. Okay? All right then. All right, so that brings us to the end today. All right, and then I'll email you the links for the two websites, and we'll meet again tomorrow for the cardiovascular system. We'll discuss the blood vessels and the heart. Thank you.